All right, that's the last time you get to applaud until the bitter, bitter end. Thank you very much. Debate is a tool for gathering information to make responsible decisions. Like any tool, it must be used correctly. Therefore, we have a few rules before we begin, and I ask that, first off, that the audience members please turn off all your electronic devices, and please reserve your applause for the end of the debate. Gentlemen, as you know, the order of your responses was determined randomly prior to the debate. We will attempt to rigorously adhere to the format agreed to, and no additional time will be provided for follow-up questions in this forum. We will stick to time limits agreed upon. Microphones will be cut off at my direction should you wax eloquent. Please stay on the issues, fully addressing the questions being asked. Going off topic, particularly into personal attacks or questions, is an irresponsible use of our time, and I will redirect you to the question. I know we are all most interested in giving the public the most information possible and will maintain a proper level of decorum. I'd like to point out that these questions are in 3 different categories. First are debate questions that have been presented from members of the 4 co-sponsoring clubs. Second are audience questions, which Mr. Anderson mentioned earlier are being collected by our members throughout the House. These will be screened by our group and then asked later in the debate. And finally, the candidates have selected their own questions to ask one or both of the other candidates at their discretion. We'll begin with some opening statements, 2 minutes long, gentlemen. I hope you can see the clock. If not, I'll flap or something like that. We'll begin with Mr. Treadwell.
Good morning. Good afternoon. I'm Meade Treadwell. I'm your Lieutenant Governor, and I'm running for the U.S. Senate. To know a little bit about me, I'm a single dad with 3 kids. 2 of my children are here, William and Natalie. And we lost their mom. Carol lost her life in a fight with cancer about a dozen years ago. She left me these children in kindergarten, a minivan, and I just want to say they've raised me well. I also am a businessman. I've helped create jobs, helped create value. I didn't come from inherited wealth, and at the rate this campaign's going, I don't think my children will either. But let me talk about what this race is about. This race is about Alaska, and this race is about Alaska versus D.C. And one of the real questions that we have as you make up your mind in this race is we should send somebody to Alaska who knows Alaska, who has been here and has taken the time to work with the issues and to understand what people needs. Because there are actually 2 Senate races going on right now. There's the one in the Washington polls, and there's the one here in Alaska. And the question that I think all of us are asking is, will outside money pick our nominee, or is it up to us to pick our nominee? Because this is your Senate seat. It's not Karl Rove's Senate seat. It's not the Chamber's Senate seat. It's not Harry Reid's Senate seat. It's your Senate seat. Now, I'm an Alaskan, and my identity as an Alaskan doesn't come because I've lived here and shoveled a lot of snow and been to dozens of Iditarod starts. My background is an Alaskan because I've been in the battles with you for our self-determination. You know, this book we wrote prompted the Hickel lawsuits to help preserve our statehood compact. And later, after we didn't do as well, we put an amendment in the state constitution to protect our compact. And where I come from is this. We have a government that spends too much, borrows too much, prints too much, meddles too much, snoops too much. And we in Alaska are part of turning that around, bringing decision-making home, and I would be honored to have your vote. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Miller.
Good evening. Special thanks goes out to the Anchorage Republican women and Judy Elledge, who, despite significant opposition, got this thing off the ground. I think they all deserve a round of applause. You know, there's no doubt this country is at a crossroads. This race is about Alaska, but as the country goes, so goes Alaska. We're sitting at $17.5 trillion in actual debt, over $200 trillion in future unfunded liabilities. Just this last week, we heard a statistic that should have, I think, shaken all of us to our cores. In the last quarter, our GDP actually shrunk by 2.9%. This is a country which right now is under attack in many ways. The family, the traditional family, is under assault like it's never been. Do you know that all children born to mothers under the age of 30, a majority of them are born to single-headed households? That's a fact. Here we are after Roe v. Wade, over 40 years, 56 million dead and counting. We're at a point because of where both parties in this country have taken us. We're at this point because we've elected people that decide that they want to compromise, that don't have the internal fortitude to stand up for you and your rights, but instead go do the bidding of special interest. And why is that? Well, you can tell by their past history. You can tell by their funding. You can tell that when the hard decisions come to be made, what do? If they end up going with the establishment, you can be guaranteed when they go to D.C., they aren't going to take up the hard fight. I mean, look at what we've done with the House of Representatives. In 2010 and 2012, we had something like 90 House members elected to the Tea Party caucus, and yet only 23 could muster a vote against the debt ceiling increase. There is a tremendous amount of compromise that occurs in Washington, D.C. We hear the empty rhetoric every election. You need to go down and see what people are actually for, what's behind them, and make a decision whether or not you're going to save this country for your kids and our grandkids. We've got to do it. This country is the greatest nation on earth, but it's up to you to make the hard choices. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Sullivan.
Well, good evening, everybody. And Republicans here, one big happy family, correct? A little squabbling, of course, before a primary, but, you know, all families have squabbling, right? But it's great to be here. I do want to thank Judy as well and the rest of the Republican women who put this debate on. Now, I'm here before you as a very blessed man. I have my amazing wife, Julie, in the audience right there. 20 years ago, we were married in her hometown of Fairbanks. We've been blessed with 3 amazing teenage daughters. We're very busy in the Sullivan household. Raised here in Alaska, my oldest daughter, Megan, is going to be a senior at South. She's here tonight as well. But I'm also blessed because, like all of you, we live in the greatest state in the greatest country in the world. I am an American by birth and an Alaskan by choice, like my fellow candidates. And I love this country, and I love this state. And I have dedicated much of my career to serving both, including defending my country after the terrorist attacks of 9/11. And we are here, all of us, because the country we love is fundamentally going in the wrong direction. The way we change that and start to change the direction of this country is to make sure Mark Begich is a one-term senator.
What specifically will you do in the Senate to develop this opportunity? Mr. Treadwell, you have 3 minutes.
Thank you. I see great opportunities in Alaska from 3 different kinds of economic activity. Our resources in the ground and beneath the sea. Our strategic location, and that resource that we have to develop between our ears, between our kids' ears, because Alaska is also a knowledge-based economy. In natural resources, right now we have huge economies in oil, gas, mining, tourism, growth of the CDQs, the community development quotas, tremendous opportunity in Southeast Alaska for hundreds of millions of dollars of new income in shellfish. What we're working on to get a natural gas pipeline going, to get the Outer Continental Shelf going, is likely to bring about $100 billion or more in investment to our state. And we are better off now because we kept our promise to help make Alaska competitive. The mining opportunities here are tremendous. Our strategic location, it is our bases, our military bases, our airport. We're the 5th largest in the world. We have 47,000 aviation jobs, 50,000 or more fisheries jobs. The launch site at Kodiak. And I'm working very hard as your Lieutenant Governor to make sure that Alaska is cut in and Vladimir Putin doesn't control the shipping in the Arctic, because shipping in the Arctic has got the same kind of potential for Alaska as we have had with aviation, polar aviation. But let me just finish by saying I think the most important resource we have to develop is that resource within all of us, that resource between our ears. I'm very concerned that the federal government, which is so much pushing back on natural resource development, so ignorant about our strategic position, is also slamming Common Core down our throats and not letting Alaskans make the kinds of decisions, and Alaska families make the kind of decisions they need to make in education. And I have been in the process of bringing intellectual capital to market, bringing businesses together. And I will just say this, Alaskans are incredibly innovative people, and we've got great opportunities in alternative energy. We have a generation of young Alaskans coming forward because of programs like the Native Corporation's 8A program, because of the Alaska Native Science and Engineering program, because of programs that we've had to the Governor's Performance Scholarship to get kids to take the tough classes in math and science. I believe that we will be creating as much in a diversified economy from our knowledge as we do from our resources. And as your senator, I will explain a little bit later in this program some of the ideas that we've got on natural resource development. We've got to be doing much, much more to fill the vacuum that the U.S. has left in the Arctic for our locational development. And we have to stand up for our kids in education because we know how to educate our kids and we know how to compete in the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Miller, your response.
Well, obviously, the future of this economy is primarily based upon the natural resources, the riches that we have in the state. They're second to none. I mean, you look at whether natural gas, gold, coal, the timber industry, the rare earth metals. I mean, we have ANWR, we have OCS, we have NPR. We have all these resources that we'll talk about a little bit more tonight about how we pry those open and we develop those for the benefit of the state. I look at North Dakota. I mean, I think that's a model for all of us. I mean, you look at the small state, Balkan Formation, obviously blessed with hydrocarbons, but their hydrocarbon resources are second. They aren't even third to ours. We've got a tremendous resource in this state that we have to encourage development for. It's not just a federal issue. There are also state incentives, I think, that need to apply to ensure that we can have the independents active in this state like we've seen in the Midwest of the United States. I mean, that's a state that has, it's nearing 2% unemployment. It's extraordinary. We have opportunity here that we haven't seized. We also have other opportunities with the federal lands, in part because of the new political realities that we have in this country. For one, this last fall during the government shutdown, what did Obama do? Well, he decided to play the games he normally does and decided to retaliate against you, the people, we, the people, shutting down federal parks and lands, even though he didn't need to. He did it to basically get his pound of flesh. And that caused people to start to think, should the federal government really be in control of these lands? Then we had the thing that happened in Nevada with the Bundy Ranch standoff. And what did that show the American people? Again, the federal government in control of lands that it shouldn't be. I'll say this again probably later tonight. Article 1, Section 8, 18 enumerated powers. The feds need to get out of those things that it shouldn't be in, and that includes our resource base. Something else that is a little bit different from what you heard from Lieutenant Governor Treadwell is the tax burden that this country has and how it limits productivity, it limits growth. I'm an advocate for eliminating all taxes, save one. It's called the fair tax. It's called eliminating the corporate income tax. It's called creating an economic engine like nothing else that would benefit not just, of course, this great state of Alaska, but all states across the United States. Immediately flooding into our economy would be about $13 trillion in money that right now is offshore and tax shelter, foreign tax shelters. It would encourage research and investment unlike anything we've ever seen. And you, Alaskans, when you come home from work with your paycheck, guess what? You've got the whole paycheck. There's nothing taken out for taxes. That type of massive economic involvement would create a magnet. It would be a magnet for all excess money in the world today to come into this country and create jobs in economies like we've never seen. And that's something that we'll need people of strong, I think, fabric in the Congress to do because it's significant. It's a change in the way we do things. It's called abolish the IRS. Get rid of the abusive agency that's been used as a weapon by the Obama administration and free up the American economy to do what it can. Thank you.
Mr. Sullivan.
Well, the opportunities with regard to the economic development of Alaska are limitless. And what's going on not only in Alaska but the country, particularly in the energy and natural resource space, is nothing but a revolution. We have an energy renaissance that's taking place throughout the United States where we're going to be the world's energy superpower once again. It's tremendous in so many ways. We have a federal government that doesn't want to seize it. They need to seize it. And Alaska needs to be leading this energy renaissance. We can be. And it's not just oil and gas, it's in all our natural resources. But we are turning the corner. That is the good news. We are turning the corner. Now, my fellow candidates here talk about ideas. One thing I'm proud of is my record. We have turned the corner because we have instituted policies of less government, more economic freedom, regulatory reform, tax reform, whether it's the turnaround in Cook Inlet that is creating hundreds of jobs, or on the North Slope, or on the gas line with Point Thompson. All of these are areas that with the governor, I had the opportunity to lead on. And it's not just talking. It's not just going to conferences. It's setting out strategies and executing them relentlessly. You know, Joe, you once mentioned in one of our forums the great turnaround in Cook Inlet. It is a great turnaround, but it wasn't magic. This was hard strategy that I had the opportunity to lead for Alaskans. What is also happening, though, is a federal government that is not focused on resource development. And what we need to do, what we have to do, is have a federal government that helps us, that partners with us. It does not undermine us. And in every one of the areas in Alaska, because of Mark Begich's failures, we have moved backwards. We need more access to our federal lands, not less. But what we're seeing in terms of what's happening on the North Slope because of oil tax reform, SB 21, that is something, again, that the governor asked me to lead on. Strategy, execution, not just a press release, but long hours of making that happen. And that's the difference. That's the difference. I'm a candidate right now who has a record of getting results for the middle class, turning this state around, particularly with regard to our resource development. If you want to make sure we have middle-class opportunities, more jobs, more energy, as you're seeing in Cook Inlet. If you remember, 3 years ago, we were talking about brownouts, importing gas from Canada. No way. We stood strong, we put together strategies, and now we have huge opportunities. Alaska can be an example for the country, and our resource opportunities are tremendous.
Thank you, Mr. Treadwell. You have 1 minute to respond.
Well, thank you. There are two things I didn't hear. One is I didn't hear Commissioner Sullivan talk about getting more federal lands back to Alaska. We all agree on access, but I am sick and tired of a federal government that keeps making plans where we have nothing to say about it. Cutting NPRA in half, we have nothing to say about it. Kicking the can on OCS, we have nothing to say about it. When I run on bringing decision-making home, I am absolutely serious that we have to join with people like Jim Inhofe, who sponsored a bill that says the energy rights to public lands belong to the states. Don Young has a bill. There's a bill that has passed the House of Representatives right now that would give Forest Service land back to several of the states. And the point of it is this. When we asked for 100 million acres at statehood, we didn't get enough because we lost the federal government as a development partner. The federal government has shown its incompetence in making development and environmental protection work in Alaska, and it's time to take them out of the job and do exactly what Canada did in the Yukon, exactly what Canada just did in the Northwest Territories, exactly what Denmark did in Greenland, which is give control of the land to the people who live here.
Thank you. We now come to the section where candidates may ask questions of their opponents. We will begin with Mr. Treadwell. You have 1 minute to ask your question, and then we'll have responses and a follow-up.
Well, thank you. And Dan, I said to you at the beginning of this campaign it was not going to be a demolition derby, and I am not here to ask you a zinger tonight. I am here to say, however, that if you're going to represent Alaska, it's helpful that we know Alaska, and we were supposed to have a debate, which I know we couldn't have in Kodiak, but I think we owe it to the 50,000 Alaskans who work in Alaska fisheries to know what your plans are with the renewal of the Magnuson-Stevens Act. It's critical for everyone who fishes in Alaska. I fought for that. One of my first jobs here in Alaska to help us get the 200-mile limit and drive the foreign fishing offshore. So on what pieces of this legislation do you see, and what are the threats that you see to Alaska's fishermen with the renewal of the Act?
Mr. Sullivan, you have 3 minutes to respond.
Right, thanks. Well, Meade, I wanted to follow up, though, on a point that you made in your previous comment about access to federal lands. You better believe I think we need additional access to federal lands. And this, again, is the difference between the candidates. As opposed to just talking about it, I put together a comprehensive plan under ANILCA 1002E for over a year that says you can explore in ANWR with a comprehensive plan. We put that forward to the Obama administration. They rejected it, of course, and now that's in the courts. But that's action. That's what I'm talking about, not just talk, taking action to benefit Alaskans. So in terms of access to federal lands, I'm not talking about a bill. I'm talking about action that's already in the courts, and we might win that, and we will be exploring in ANWR. You know, with regard to your question on the fisheries, obviously another hugely important industry within the state of Alaska. I think in terms of employment, second only to the oil and gas industry. So it's critical, critical. My history in Alaska is with, as I've mentioned before, my wife Julie. They have a fish camp on the Yukon River. I've been very much focused on what's going on in the interior, but also as I campaign, you see all the different issues with regard to fisheries. We have a very well-managed fishery, but the issue of abundance, the issue of what's causing things like the king salmon declines on the Yukon and other rivers is a hugely important issue. I think one of the things within the Magnuson-Stevens Act we can do for Alaskans, I'm a limited government Republican, but an area of research to seeing what's happening with regard to our fisheries with the help of the federal government is absolutely positively critical. It's also important that we focus on abundance and not politicize different elements of our fisheries. So right now, with regard to the Magnuson-Stevens Act, the reauthorization, I know it's a very important issue, but one of the things that we don't need in that act is Congress coming down and dictating the allocations. We need to make sure we have a strong local input from all our different fisheries groups in the different regions of the state to make sure that Alaskans have the input and it's not a dictate from Washington, which is one of the big problems in the natural resource sector, including fisheries.
Thank you. Mr. Treadwell, you have 2 minutes to rebut.
Well, thank you. And Dan, let me just suggest for the rest of this debate that talk, not action, doesn't really work very well. And when it comes to our fisheries, I've been involved in the fight to make that science that you just dreamed about to happen, to get us the $30 million at state level to do the salmon fisheries research that we've been talking about, to bring our Chinook back, to get the North Pacific Research Board established, to get NOAA focusing more on what it is going to mean, abundance, meeting with the Russian ambassador last week, planning to make sure that we have the data from Russia which says they have zero bycatch. And this is more than inside baseball. This is the future of Alaska, folks, and jobs for 50,000 Alaskans. We have to make sure that the people, the liberals who want to take the control away of our fisheries from the regionalization don't win. We have to make sure that the ocean policy concepts that would zone the ocean, and as Ted Stevens said, you'll never take another fish out of the sea with some of the ocean policy concepts that are being pushed right now. We have to make sure that we involve Alaskans and Alaska Natives in co-management. We have to make sure that the bureaucracy is supporting our communities, because so much of the transfer of quotas have a whole lot to do with our communities throughout the state. And Dan, on the 1002E business, let me just tell you, you know, we had a good working relationship. You were the commissioner, I was the lieutenant governor, and for your ANWR program where we were rejected, there's actually other clauses in ANILCA that had we been talking. And had you come talk to the lieutenant governor before this thing came out, we have other rights also to insist on mineral assessment in the state. And, you know, I just don't accept this idea. Ladies and gentlemen, Alaskans elected us. We put good people in there. And when you decided that you were going to run against the guy who helped you get there,
Time.
we quit doing what we needed to be doing.
Thank you. We now move on to our second debate question. Mr. Miller, you will answer first. Alaska is clearly driven by development of our many natural resources. What is the #1 impediment to the responsible development of Alaska's natural resources, and what will you do to eliminate this barrier?
The #1 factor is compromise. Dan, you're right. We're all Republicans that are sitting up here. But for 30 of the last 34 years, Republicans have controlled the House, the Senate, and or the presidency. You know, in this state, Kathleen and I have been here 20 years. When we arrived, we were hearing about opening ANWR. We had the most powerful senator in the U.S. Senate. This is something that those of you who've been here longer or shorter have heard probably all the time. And yet, what have we done as a state? We've chosen the easy money. Well, the easy money is drying up. We've gone from $12 billion down to what, something like $5 billion now? Earmarks are pretty much gone. We're in an era where the government is facing insolvency and bankruptcy. But that's the choice that we've taken. That's the road that we've traveled. And instead of putting that political leverage toward opening up the resource base, we've instead decided to go another way. We should do everything in our power, especially given what's coming down the pike. We don't know when that shoe's going to drop as far as when the money can't be paid back, but it's coming and will come within our lifetimes. And at that point, of course, it's all stop for those that are dependent. Not just, of course, those individuals, many of it, even in this state, in the bush and otherwise, but states themselves that are dependent on the federal dollar. And so we must, at this point, do everything we can and use every leverage of political power that we have to wrest control of the resource base. We have to do it. We got to drill, baby, drill. What's behind the compromise, though? What is behind this complacency? It is environmentalism run amok, and that really is truly what backs it. You know, we've got, for example, the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act. They're being used to stop development. I mean, some of those laws were used by Begich's allies when he shut down, or his allies tried to shut down the Chukchi Sea drilling and actually delayed it for about a year. You know, Rand Paul said, and I think this is appropriate to understand when we're talking about the EPA, EPA regulations cost more than 5% of our annual gross domestic product, the equivalent of the cost of defense and homeland security combined. Since EPA regulations have expanded, unemployment in America has increased by 33%. This abuse of power by the implementation of regulations infringes upon our basic constitutional rights. You know, this is a systemic problem. This is not something that's going to be cured by, you know, taking one small thing, tweaking it here, tweaking it there, filing a lawsuit and expecting results from an activist court that doesn't agree with the Constitution or the limitations on constitutional powers. I mean, for crying out loud, I've filed a lawsuit against the Corps of Engineers too over a wetlands determination on permafrost. Did it change anything? No, we got shut down at the Ninth Circuit. Why? Because we have a bunch of activist judges. This is something that has to be done through, I think, bold moves like Senator Cruz's American Energy Renaissance Act, which would allow the transfer, actually the leasing of federal lands back to the state for resource development. Ultimately, a goal, of course, is to move federal lands into title of the Alaska state, because we have not been admitted under equal footing. Instead, we're just a serf, basically a territorial outpost of the imperial Washington, D.C. machine. But it's going to require strong, bold leadership and action to do it. We can't do it with the type of, you know, kind of pansy footing around. We've got to have boldness and courage and can't be compromised.
Thank you. Mr. Treadwell, you have 3 minutes.
What's holding back natural resource development in the state of Alaska? 2 words: the federal government. I have experience as an investor, as somebody in civic life who's helped promote our natural resources, as lieutenant governor, working with oil, liquefied natural gas, mining, timber, fishing, electric power, and tourism. And we're a natural resource state, and we're also a knowledge-based state. Now, I have been in the fight for access, and I will be in the fight for access as your U.S. Senator. We have physical access. We need ports. We need roads. We need railroads. We need pipelines. And those are things that will make our natural resources go to market. We need legal access, rights to get to the land. And what the Obama administration has been doing has been absolutely abominable. And we also need intellectual access. I chaired the U.S. Arctic Research Commission. Knowing what we have, knowing how to get it out safely is incredibly important. But you know what? In Washington, that's not the last word. They may think it's the last word, but it's the first word, because here at home, then we need access to labor. Then we need access to capital, and we always need access to markets. You know, I worked a lot with Senator Ted Stevens on selling our natural resource assets in the Pacific Basin. He made an annual trip to Japan and to other Pacific countries to make sure they understood how important Alaska was to them and how important we were to our mutual, to the mutual security of our countries. We're going to be back there. I've made over 30 trips to those countries, and we're going to be back there in Japan, Korea, helping us, Alaska sell LNG, continuing our efforts in coal, continuing our efforts in oil. And I fought for oil export when it had cost $15 billion to our permanent fund and helped draft the legislation that finally got it through. There's one other thing that I think we have to remember in natural resource development in our state, which is we can make money selling our resources abroad, but if we figure out ways to do value added with our resources here, we make more money, have more jobs for our kids. Ask the people of North Pole. Don't look at Mark Baggage's ads on the Koch brothers. Ask the people of North Pole. What royalty policy did we have as a state that we had to do fast cleanup after Commissioner left to make sure that we were attractive to keeping our refineries open? It was a real problem. And ask the people who lost their jobs on the Alaska Railroad, should the state have had a royalty policy that was conducive to value added? We have value added opportunities all over this state. We have them in timber. We have them in natural gas. We have them with our refineries. And we have to continue to push that part of natural resource development as well. Thank you.
Mr. Sullivan.
Well, I think it's pretty obvious what the biggest impediment is, and I saw it when I was your Attorney General. I saw it as your Commissioner of Natural Resources. And even more pointedly, I've seen it as a candidate. The issue of federal overreach with regard to our great state is everywhere. I used to think it was just in the resource sector. It is everywhere. Tourism, financial industry, fishing, small businesses, big businesses. There is hardly an Alaskan that I have met on the campaign trail that does not have some story about federal overreach. Remember, what do we have in Washington right now? We have a senator who is carrying the water for Barack Obama and Harry Reid. He votes with Barack Obama 97% of the time. And his first vote, if he's reelected, in the U.S. Senate will be to make Harry Reid the Senate Majority Leader. Harry Reid, the guy who said, one of the joys of my life was when I killed that bill by Senator Ted Stevens to explore for ANWR. This is the Democrat Senate majority's views of Alaska. That's why Senator Baggett has got to go and Harry Reid has to go. But let me make another point here, because I couldn't disagree more with Meade. This is about talk versus action. This is exactly about talk versus action and records. And I talked about my record, and I can go into it, about setting out strategies to help Alaskans, all of us, create the jobs and opportunity in the resource sector. We've been successful. Point Thompson, which I worked on for over 2.5 years to settle and permit. 1,200 Alaskans working on that multi-billion-dollar project. Last winter, 1,500 this winter. Those are results. But I also want to talk about being in the arena fighting. Because right now in Washington, we do not have a fighter. We have a lapdog for the Obama administration. We used to have a fighter in Ted Stevens. We don't have that anymore. And when I was your Attorney General in 2009, and I saw the onslaught of this federal government, Obama administration, in every part of our sector of economy, I thought it was really important to fight it. And I have a long record of battling this administration successfully. And Joe, I couldn't disagree with you more. We won a case that I originally brought just 3 days ago in the U.S. Supreme Court with the EPA, putting them in their place. Read that opinion. It's a powerful opinion to limit the authority of the EPA, which is one of the most critical things we need. So we need a fighter again in Washington, and I have a record of action, not talk, on all of these issues: endangered species, suing Salazar when he put the Arctic moratorium on us.
Time.
And that's what we need back in Washington. And Mark Begich, we don't have it.
Thank you. Mr. Miller, 1 minute to rebut.
What we don't need is somebody that claims to be a fighter, but behind him is being funded by Karl Rove, who is behind the very things that are destroying this country.
Ladies and gentlemen.
When we are, when we sit back and we look at the expanse of time the Republicans have controlled the process, and we hear about this more of this tweaking around the edges, we've got to have bold action. We can't be talking about, restraining the EPA a little bit here or there. This is a time for action such as maybe scaling back the EPA, maybe abolishing the EPA, maybe doing those things that we as a people have the power to do if we only add to the alliance of people like Mike Lee and Ted Cruz. We have the capacity to do it. We've got an increasingly bankrupt federal government. This is time to think big, not around the edges like we've heard for decades. In fact, most of the arguments that you've heard here tonight, you could have turned the clock back an election or two or three or four ago, and you would have heard the same thing. And yet still the federal government remains in control. Why? Because we, the people, haven't taken back the power.
Time. And now, Mr. Miller, you may ask one or both candidates a question. You have 1 minute.
Well, Dan, since you've got all the money, I'll ask this question of you, too. This is a little bit fun, though. Don't be nervous. On June 13th, on the Mike Piccaro show, you said, I don't even know, quote, I don't even know if my opponents, quote, know what the dangerous end of a rifle looks like, end quote. And again on that show, quote, I don't even know if they know what to do with a rifle or a pistol. And the fact is, I've hunted since I was a kid. I shot on an NCAA rifle team at West Point, graduated in the top 1% of my class there too, incidentally. Combat vet. My tank platoon actually shot high in the 1st Infantry Division when I was stationed at Fort Riley. My tank was credited with one of the first kills in the Gulf War of the 1st Brigade. Hunted all across this great land. In fact, killed a Kodiak bear just a few inches from my gun barrel. Now, you're also running ads on the public airways that say, as Alaska's Attorney General, you successfully fought to protect our Second Amendment rights and passed Standard Ground. The truth is, Standard Ground was passed more than 2 years after you left the Attorney General's office, and we also have a letter with your name on it that says that you opposed it. How do you expect Alaskans to have faith in your candidacy? Is this bar talk, or do you really mean it?
Well, Joe, when you mentioned the Piccaro statement, I wasn't referring to you. I knew that you were someone who shot and gets out on the range a lot, but I think there's some other candidates. Mark Begich, I'm not sure he knows what the pointy end of a rifle looks like, but with regard to the Second Amendment, yeah, let me talk about the Second Amendment, because again, I think this is another example where we have talk, a lot of talk, versus action. And with regard to stand your ground, to be perfectly honest, I'm getting a little tired of the whisper campaign that's been going on with regard to stand your ground. I am someone like you who's worn the uniform, continues to wear the uniform of my country. I deployed to Afghanistan last summer. I very much, Joe, honor your service, as I do all veterans. As a matter of fact, the veterans' issues have been one of the key issues in my entire campaign. By the way, another area that Mark Begich has been asleep at the wheel on that we need to change. But with regard to 20 years in the Marine Corps, I'm a lieutenant colonel right now, running what's called a Marine Anglico unit, serves with the Army. As a matter of fact, I was just down at Fort Lewis last weekend doing my Marine Corps training. You can always tell my wife says every day is a bad hair day in the Marine Corps when I'm going to do my training, so got the high and tight right now. But, so my commitment to our Constitution as someone like you who has not just raised their hand but has gone to deploy to defend it is never going to waver. And that is particularly the case with regard to the Second Amendment. And let me give you another example of action. I was the Attorney General in Alaska who joined with other AGs to ask the Supreme Court to take what was called the McDonald versus Chicago case. They took it to hear it. And then we asked them to rule in favor for the first time in American history that the right to bear arms was an individual right that belonged to Americans. And we won that 5-4. That's action. That's protecting the Second Amendment. That's defending the Second Amendment. Mark Begich, by the way, voted for the 2 of the judges who were in the dissent. So don't listen to him about his Second Amendment bona fides. And with regard to stand your ground, as I mentioned, my staff worked with Mark Newman to simplify his original bill to get it through the House in 2010. It didn't pass that year because the state Senate did not pass it. But I've been a strong supporter of Stand Your Ground, and I continue to support Stand Your Ground, and the accusations otherwise are just inaccurate, and you know it.
Thank you. Mr. Miller, you have 2 minutes to respond.
Well, this is the point that I've made on the airways, and it's a point that I continue to make. When we confront, the type of rhetoric that we get from candidates at election time, I think people ought to go to the source material. I mean, that's what we've always done. We've given you the source material. And when somebody sits back and says that, oh yeah, I supported Stand Your Ground, but then wrote a letter on March 15, 2010 that attacked, your name's on it. You were the Attorney General, correct?
It's a staff, staffer, it's not my letter.
Are you saying that the ADN was wrong in portraying your support or your opposition, Stand Your Ground, that entire article that was written? Moderator, can I have my piece?
Yes.
And you can respond on your own time on another question if you like. I'm not trying to be mean to you, but I think that people need to hear what you said. This avoids the unnecessary loss of life by eliminating the duty to retreat. You're talking about the duty to retreat. This is your second paragraph in the letter, again dated March 15, 2010, that you wrote as the Attorney General. You had somebody else sign it, but you wrote it. The ADN said this was your letter. The ADN said, in fact, this was your position. ADN's not particularly a friend of mine, but nevertheless. But anyway, you're talking about the duty to retreat, and you said that the duty to retreat avoids the unnecessary loss of life and encourages our citizens to seek ways other than violence to resolve disputes. The addition of subsections 5 and 6, that was the Stand Your Ground, the original Stand Your Ground legislation, of this statute eradicates the duty to retreat. In fact, should they be enacted, there would no longer be a duty to retreat in Alaska. That is to say, if person A could avoid killing person B by walking away, she would no longer be required to do so, but instead would be authorized by law to kill person B. Now that's an unequivocal statement against eradicating the duty to retreat. And yet you're on the airways. I mean, I don't even listen to the radio much anymore because all I hear are these Sullivan ads. But that's why we as a people, we have to get down to brass tacks. Look at the information, folks, because you're going to hear all sorts of stuff this election season.
Our next debate question, and Mr. Sullivan, you may respond first. This is on national security. What is America's role in the world? And do you support an aggressive U.S. foreign policy, or do you favor a more libertarian approach? Please explain. And how will you implement your foreign policy views while in the Senate?
Well, my first view with regard to American foreign policy is I deeply, deeply believe in American exceptionalism. That we are a unique nation in the history of nations and a force for good in the world. And look at history. It's pretty obvious. We've freed more people from tyranny than any other country in the history of the world. Here's the problem. You literally have an administration for the first time ever, I think, in American history, where the President of the United States essentially said he doesn't believe in American exceptionalism. You remember the question, do you believe in it? And he said, yeah, I believe in American exceptionalism the way the Greeks believe in Greek exceptionalism, and Germans believe in German exceptionalism. That means he doesn't believe in it. That has been the source of so many other issues, mainly that we've gotten to the point where our friends no longer trust us and our adversaries no longer fear us. Weakness is provocative, and we have seen weakness in this administration on so many issues. And now we're seeing the chickens come home to roost. Chaos in the world, whether it's Iraq, Syria, China, Russia, all taking aggressive action because the United States has been showing weakness. To me, we have to come back to the place where the United States engages, leads, and by the way, as a Marine, as a U.S. Assistant Secretary of State, not only do I believe in American exceptionalism, I've seen other countries believe in it. I've been in Afghanistan. I've been in Europe with my former boss, Condoleezza Rice, where foreign ministers would come to her, and they knew the exceptional nature of this country, which is why what's going on in this administration is so disturbing. Let me make one other point. We've been talking about the energy renaissance in Alaska, in the country. That is one of the most important ways that we can regain our strength and our national security. Think about it. If we are once again the superpower of the world in terms of energy, producing more oil than Saudi Arabia and Russia, more natural gas, more renewables, that gives us enormous strength. In the countries that fear our superpower status as an energy superpower, once again, you know who they are: Russia, Saudi Arabia, China. We have it within our capacity here in Alaska and throughout the nation to become the world's energy superpower again, which will dramatically increase our ability to pursue America's national security and foreign policy interests throughout the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Treadwell, 3 minutes.
Thank you. To this question, I believe in a foreign policy where the United States is strong, and we're strong because we have a military that's second to none, and that our strong military, our lethal military, deters aggression. I believe we have to have behind that military a productive U.S. economy, a military that is backed up by a strong U.S. economy, an industrial complex that works, and technology leadership. And we keep turning that away. We also have to lead, because you can see right now where the vacuum has left us. In Iran, not being strong with Iran, they're a terrorist sponsor, a near nuclear power. We've been unsuccessful there. Syria and Iraq, an outgrowth of a lack of leadership, and what's happened with the fact that we stood low with Syria meant that their opportunism in Iraq is undoing what our soldiers gave their lives, their blood, and we all gave our treasure for. Israel doesn't trust us. Russia has been given a veto twice on missile defense in Europe. And we're also dependent on Russia for space launch, which is strategic to the United States. And China is pushing us back in the Pacific. We have problems here. And I know I'm sitting next to a former Assistant Secretary of State, and Dan, I respect your service there too. But I will tell you this. I've also done a whole lot in my life here in Alaska to make sure that the State Department understands Alaska and understands our needs. Because way too often, decisions are made internationally or made out of Washington where they don't understand where we even are on the map. They don't even understand who our neighbors are. We had to do this. We had to go fight against the ABM Treaty because they were going to defend 48 states and not Alaska and Hawaii. And, you know, I know nothing happened here in this state before you got here, Dan, but I mean, that was something where we went to the legislature, we got something through, we actively worked this issue, and we got missile defense for the country, and Alaskans led that. When the Japanese were taking away our whaling, I got intimately involved in that issue so that we protected North Slope whaling. On oil spills, I find myself as a pro-development lieutenant governor, beating on the Obama administration right now because we have all these Russian tankers coming through the Bering Strait, Norwegian tankers, and no oil spill prevention. Icebreakers and fish. You know, the Russians sell more fish in Alaska than more crab in the United States than they've agreed to catch in our waters. They say they have zero bycatch of salmon, and yet our rivers are not even supplying the basic subsistence fish that we need. We have to have an Alaskan foreign policy and make sure American foreign policy follows us.
Mr. Sullivan, 1 minute.
Actually, I think it's me next. But we're right. I think we're at Candidate B's rebuttal.
Yes, sorry.
No problem at all. As long as you give me time.
Yes. Well, we'll try and give you as much as everybody else.
All right. Excellent.
This time. Okay, Mr. Miller, 3 minutes.
All right. So, you know, under the Obama administration, we have had catastrophic foreign policy. I think all of us can agree that, right? I mean, we've seen what's happened in Libya. We've seen what's happened in Syria. We see what's going on right now in Iraq. We can see what's going on in Afghanistan. I mean, I've got friends that still serve. I've served in combat. Lots of other folk that I know have too. It's interesting. Most of your military men and women, I mean, it was one of the strongest blocks of support for Ron Paul. You want to know why? Because we reject nation building. We reject it because it's not within our national interest. And because very frequently what happens is, and again, I respect Dan Sullivan's service, but the fact of it is that when you go to Afghanistan, when you go to Iraq, what you find is, if you're a Christian, for example, you want to go out there and proselytize, you want to go out there and witness to people, you know what happens? Probably going to have a sword to your neck. We have not restored, or we have not given freedoms to these countries. We have not established constitutions that have been successful in guaranteeing the same sort of freedoms that this country has. In other words, the nation building has been a failure. And in fact, we can see right now in Iraq an example of that, with basically the struggle between an Iranian-backed regime that we installed effectively, and we even have Iranians at one point that were in Iraq, still may be actually out there training Iranians or Iraqis against the Sunni-backed rebels that were coming across the northern part of Iraq. And why is it that we're leaving a nation or have left a nation where that's happened? You know, some may argue, well, because we didn't stay long enough. You know what? We could stay there generations. We could stay there generations, and the same thing would be going on. The Middle East has been a cauldron of violence for thousands of years. This is not something that we're going to solve, and I got to tell you, our founders never intended us to do that. You bet. Our founders intended us to be a bright, shining city on a hill. We are to be an example and a beacon for all other nations, and some have followed our lead, although we are the only nation that says to its people, your people have the rights given by God, not by government. Your federal government is your servant. We are the master. And there are very few nations on earth like that. We can't impose that from above, and we certainly should not do that with the blood, sweat, and tears of our men and women in uniform. My son right now is a second-year cadet at West Point. He's actually home for a little bit. I got to tell you, I don't want to send him and sacrifice his life for something that's needless. We need to defend American interest, and those interests have to be defended with laser-like precision. That means we don't starve out the country because we spend all of our money on things outside of Article 1, Section 8 powers that are specified in the Constitution. Admiral Mullins himself said that the #1 national security threat to this nation is its debt crisis. And because of that, we have a military that's been hobbled. We have a Ryan Murray bill that passed out with Republicans. Why? And it cut our military retirees' budget. Why? Because of compromise. We as a people have to get behind the Constitution, do what it directs, and reestablish that model for the rest of the world. And we can do it together with your help.
Now, Mr. Sullivan, 1 minute.
2 minutes? 1 minute?
1 minute.
Okay, thank you. Well, again, I think one of the most important ways we can strengthen our national security is through a stronger economy. The economy is incredibly weak right now. Through taking advantage of our tremendous energy and natural resource opportunities. But again, I also think we're in a dangerous world, and we certainly can't just draw up the drawbridges and think everything's going to be fine. You know, one of the things that I've had, and I think we need as a senator, is someone who has high-level foreign policy and national security experience, whether it's been in the military or, as I mentioned, I served as an Assistant Secretary of State under Condoleezza Rice on a whole host of issues, but I'll give you 2 examples that are very relevant today. I played a leadership role in working on Iran sanctions, where I think this administration has been so weak on Iran that it could come home to roost for us in a very bad way. It's one of the biggest threats to the world right now, the Iranian government getting a nuclear weapon. And I led efforts to get companies throughout the world not to invest in the Iran oil and gas sector. Similarly, I worked on Caspian energy issues. What our goal was to try to keep energy production in the Caspian, Central Asia region to not go through Russia, to make sure Vladimir Putin did not have energy sources. And we were successful, but those are the kind of issues that are still relevant today, and that as your U.S. Senator, I will be able to take a lead role on in terms of foreign policy and national security for our country.
Thank you. Mr. Sullivan, it is now your turn to ask a question of one or both of the other candidates. You have 1 minute.
So this is for Meade Treadwell. You know, Meade, you've been claiming to run a purely Alaskan campaign. And since I've gotten into the race, you've attacked me for accepting contributions from out of state. But when you got in November of 2012, you initially, when you launched your campaign, you said it's going to be very important to raise millions of dollars to compete with Mark Begich. You hired one of the top fundraisers in the country, and in 2013, you held numerous fundraising meetings with donors, with your fellow lieutenant governors, with super PACs. So can you give us a number of how many of those fundraisers you had in 2013? And were you traveling on the state's dime when you went to these numerous fundraisers in the lower 48?
Thanks, Dan. I'm glad you're so concerned about outside money.
That was funny.
Well, was that the answer?
No.
I'm just wondering. I mean, you seem very concerned about it.
Let me put it this way: we have a procedure in state government where if any political activity takes place when you're on a trip, you pay for it through the campaign, and I did, and I followed the letter of the law and the regulations in every part. I can't tell you exactly how many were ones where we paid our own way. It was almost all of them. There were a few where our way was paid by others, and that's that. I will say this. This is a very important race. But what's happened in this race right now is that outside forces have decided with huge arrogance, it's not the individual contributors, it's the outside forces who said, we can pick your senator instead of you pick your senator. It's the outside forces who said, let's just blow the locals out in the primary and take our Washington guy. It's the outside forces who, you know, your brother's on the chamber board. The chamber didn't hold a fair process. It didn't even talk to local businesses. The Club for Growth, didn't vet you as a conservative. You're not a conservative in many of the issues that they're very concerned about. Okay? And the fact is, Dan, is that I followed the letter of the law, and I will just tell you, before you got into the race, while you were still a state employee, I'd show up in a community and somebody would say, well, Ambassador so-and-so has just called everybody in town, and just hold off. Don't help Treadwell. There's another guy getting the race named Sullivan. So I decided to focus our efforts in Alaska, and we have. And most of our contributions have come from Alaska, while most of your contributions have come from outside. And you know what? In the Iowa primary recently, the same forces that have given money to my opponent outspent the winner 4-1. And we've seen that a number of other places. This is your Senate seat. It's not Karl Rove's Senate seat. It's not the Chamber Senate seat. It's not your brother's Senate seat. I sometimes feel like I'm running against a paint company from Ohio. It is our Senate seat. And this is the first debate that we've had, and I'm very glad that your own poll shows us surging, and thank you very much for that.
Well, Meade, I just find it a little ironic that the guy who is complaining is the guy who spent a lot of time in 2013, certainly more than I did, with regard to going to outside groups, outside super PACs. The Club for Growth endorsed me. They vetted me as the most conservative, fiscally conservative candidate in this race. They endorsed Joe in 2010. They endorsed me this time. But let me tell you something else that's important. With regard to grassroots Alaska money, we have been outraising any of my opponents. And if you take away the self-financing that you're doing with regard to your candidacy, looking in the mirror and asking yourself for a loan, We're almost outraising both of you together with Alaskans, grassroots Alaskans, and that is the support that we need. But you continue to make hay on outside fundraising, and yet you did it a lot more in 2013 than anyone else at this table. You went to these super PACs, you pitched them, you wrote letters to the chamber, all the different members. I sure hope you didn't do that on your state computer. And that to me smells of hypocrisy. You went out to do it. Let me ask you this question. If you win the primary, are you going to say to all these outside groups, don't want your money? You're the one who said we have to raise millions to be competitive with Mark Begich, who has been raising money for 5 years. And so to all of a sudden find religion, not because you believed it, you didn't believe it, you made your failure something that you started to say, well, now I don't need it. But to me, it's a very, very smells of hypocrisy when you spent way more time on the state's dime in 2013 outside the state of Alaska trying to raise money outside, and you're attacking me for doing it.
Sacrament of the church, and I believe it's up to the church to define marriage, not government.
Mr. Miller.
I do not believe in specialized privileges for people that choose to engage in a lifestyle such as homosexuality. I'm against it. Unlike one of my opponents here, Meade Treadwell, I've never supported a candidate such as Democrat Matt Claim and Sheila Selcraig, who are on the wrong side of that issue here in Anchorage with a Prop 5 vote. I think it's very important when we look at what's going on in this culture today with the complete devolution of the family. I mean, I mentioned at the beginning, when you've got a family structure where you're having in families a majority of babies born out of wedlock, we should be doing everything we can to encourage the traditional family. That's the basis upon which cultures, great cultures and societies are built. I agree. I think it's God ordained. But what government should not be in the process of doing is punishing people like a baker or a photographer in the lower 48 who decide that they don't want to photograph or they don't want to bake for a gay marriage. That's fundamentally intruding on free exercise rights. Nor should we with a proposition that would require businesses to go out there and serve people they don't want to serve. That's up to them. We're a free enterprise system. We're a free exercise country, founded on being free of persecution, founded on religious freedom, and we need to embrace that and not get all squirrely around about these things that really, frankly, the American people reject. Remember Duck Dynasty? What happened with Phil Robinson when he made his statement? Well, he's getting fired, but then the next thing you know, the American people rise up. And why is that? Because these whole ideals and attitudes are being shoved down our throats by the elites, by culture, and you know what? By politicians that compromise, Republicans and Democrats alike. And yeah, I pointed over at my two opponents. Why? Because they both support Lisa Murkowski, who supports INDA, the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. What does that do? That actually requires you, if you're a person of faith that owns a business, that you might actually have to do something that violates your conscience. I'm sick and tired of that. I think we as a people need to rise up and say no more. And we can't compromise in our choices with who we elect or hold our nose and say we're going to support that person even though they support somebody that's against our values and may help facilitate yet even more intrusions on our free exercise rights. Thank you.
Mr. Sullivan, 2 minutes.
So I support the Alaska Constitution in its current form, but I think that this raises very significant issues. And one is simply the issue of federalism. Think about what's going on in Washington. You know, a lot of people struggle with this issue. Let's be honest. Okay, people of goodwill on both sides. But what you've seen is that the federal government, the president, the Congress have had an evolution, have changed their minds on their view on this within a few years ago. And all of a sudden, they're going to tell all the states, now that I've changed my mind, now you guys all change your mind. And I think that goes to the fundamental heart of federalism. These are exactly the kind of decisions that need to be made by the states. And we did that in Alaska. Let me raise another issue that I think is related in what you're seeing with the very, very aggressive federal government. And that's the broader issue of religious liberty. You now have, for the first time, particularly given Obamacare and its mandates, a whole array of institutions, religious institutions, the Catholic Church suing the federal government. Think about that, because the federal government is trying to mandate to different religious institutions how and to what degree they should believe and practice certain things that go against the fundamental tenets of their faith. So this is where I think we need to take action, and there will be Supreme Court cases, Joe kind of referenced them, coming down soon on this issue of religious liberty. But to me, we are getting in a dangerous spot if we have different religious institutions and people of faith who feel they have to sue their federal government simply to vindicate their First Amendment right to freedom of religion. And as your U.S. Senator, I will be very focused on that religious liberty issue.
Thank you. We'll return to our candidate questions. Mr. Treadwell, you have 1 minute to ask a question of your opponent.
Do I get another question? I already had one.
You get another one. Do you have
Okay.
another one? You get two.
That's great. Dan, the question I have for you, and this issue of how long have you been in the state, is one that the Democrats have had a whole lot of fun with. The issue that I've raised about your experience with the fishing community is very important. The issues that I will just say, having worked with you in the cabinet, the challenges that I've had as your lieutenant governor for many is that when a commissioner, and it can be any of our commissioners, makes a decision that doesn't really listen to people, it's the job of your elected officials to help get the needle back in the groove. And I guess the question is, when we have so many issues in Alaska that come from learning and living in Alaska, what do you say to the people, say at the Alaska Outdoor Council, who said that DNR was kind of tone deaf on access at Hatcher Pass? Or the people in North Pole who said we were tone deaf on looking at a royalty policy that would keep our jobs?
Time.
Or people, and I guess that's the question, how are you going to make up for your deficit?
Wait, remind me again what my deficit is?
Time, it's time in Alaska and experience with Alaskans and making these issues work.
So, okay.
Mr. Sullivan, you have 3 minutes.
3 minutes. Well, listen, Meade, you and Mark Begich, I think you're starting to become more of a Republican Mark Begich, because you certainly like to take the points from the Democrats' playbook. But, I think the issue of longevity in the state, in trying to determine who will be the best senator by virtue of how long you've been here, I don't think that's a good metric by which to judge who will be a good senator. Let me give you 2 examples. One, I think one of our worst senators in the state's history is Mark Begich, and he was born here. And one of our best senators, no, not one, our best senator, a guy named Ted Stevens. Let's look at Ted Stevens' life in a nutshell. Born in the Midwest, Indiana, moved up here after serving in the military, started his family here for 4 to 5 years, went back to Washington to work on big issues, critical time, then moved back to Alaska with his family and got involved in politics. Sounds like a pretty good career to me. Well, so to me, it's not length, right? I mean, you once said, I worked on the gas line for 40 years. You know what? That to me is the problem. looking at things like commissions and reports that are getting dust on shelves. We haven't moved on the gas line. The most progress we've made on the gas line has been in the last 4 years. And as your Attorney General and DNR Commissioner, I'm proud to have played a lead role with the governor and many other people on making that progress. 40 years of focusing on an issue is not leadership. It's not good for Alaska. To me, it's failure. And let me just mention one other thing. As I mentioned, 17 years ago, when I got off my first active duty tour in the Marine Corps, I moved to my wife's hometown of Fairbanks, started our family, raised our girls there. The only time I've left the state was to serve my country, particularly after the terrorist attacks of 9/11. And a lot of other Alaskans did that. And I'm proud of that service. And I think that service will help me be a better U.S. Senator. My family sacrificed during that time, came back, and I was the Attorney General and DNR Commissioner. So to me, again, it's not length, it's passion, it's energy, it's fighter, and what you can do for the state and a record of getting things done. And yes, talk versus action.
Thank you. Mr. Treadwell,
So
you have
Dan,
2 minutes.
I think the issue here on 40 years, let's just talk about this, all right? We put all our eggs in one basket taking a gas pipeline across Canada. It didn't work. My first job was to help put together an LNG proposal. It turned out there wasn't enough gas to keep the pressure at Prudhoe Bay and everything else. But you know what? The major battle that I won there was getting Ronald Reagan's permission to export that gas. And that's a battle that we had. And I worked on the export of oil too. And we got things done. And our ability to export that gas now is based on that decision we made. 40 years, sanitation. You know, the Anchorage Daily News won a Pulitzer Prize for people in peril. The federal government wanted us to sue every village on drinking water when I was at DEC. We said no. There's only 37% of Alaska villages that have running water. We've got to get that to happen. And we made that happen here. Languages. It's not a commission with a dusty report. We are now working very actively to protect Alaska Native languages because of the things we've done. And ANWR, let's just talk about your strategy on ANWR. Okay? First off, both of us should say, and we all have said, that we should be ashamed of Mark Begich, who ran against Ted Stevens with a plan to open ANWR and has not brought an ANWR bill to the floor. But we got to turn up the heat. One of the first things you and I talked about was leasing the land around ANWR, and we did that lease sale. Okay? But where's the help to get that drilling to happen on our land on the ANWR borders? Where's the help that the miners have asked for the Alaska Mineral Resource Assessment Act, which, had you talked to me before your other ANWR gambit, we would have been doing that too. So there's, you know, the point is this, is you want to dismiss my experience and go right ahead. But Alaskans know that we've been in the fight to make statehood work for a long period of time. And we know how to listen to Alaskans and not just talk with the, you know, not just talk.
Thank you. Our next audience question. Should a special prosecutor be appointed to investigate the IRS scandal? And we'll begin with Mr. Miller.
You know, I think what's happened with the IRS is an abomination. I mean, you've got right now a president that has used that agency in ways far worse than any predecessor. I mean, President Nixon resigned for crimes less than what we've seen committed here. I mean, I think what we've had, though, is a failure not just of the presidency with respect to the abuses of power that have been worked through the IRS, but also, again, a failure of compromising Republicans to hold the president accountable. That is a fact. The reason why they don't really want to hold the IRS accountable is, guess who they targeted? They targeted you. And the ruling class, frankly, doesn't like you. They don't. They'd prefer to keep you down. You know, they don't want that Tea Party out there. They don't want conservatives out there, the pro-Israel lobby, all those other folk that are out there fighting for foundational values. Those people that are out there that are actually in the grassroots are a problem. And they were the ones that were targeted by the IRS. And so instead of having real action taken, such as the appointment of a special prosecutor, instead we have go along, get along. Oh, you know, Boehner doesn't want to offend anybody. Cantor certainly didn't want to. Guess what happened to Cantor? He got defeated, didn't he? And guess who defeated him? You know, we've heard about all these polls, right? Well, he was 32 points down by his opponent's polling the Friday before he won by 11 points, a 43-point spread. You know, Alaskans have heard this song and dance before, right? I mean, I'm happy with it because, you know, my opponents are targeting each other. But the fact of it is, back in 2010, what did we see? 37 points down, 30 points down, just a few weeks before the primary. Anytime that you're dealing with somebody that wants to stand up to these issues, you're going to be targeted. You're going to have a prime target on your back, and they're going to try to keep you down in ways that don't allow you to address the real issues. The real issues like the IRS scandal, but even underneath it, the more fundamental issue of a president that does not care about the rule of law.
Time.
I think he needs to be impeached. That's the short of it.
Mr. Sullivan, you have 2 minutes.
So I think that the answer to the question is yes on the special prosecutor, certainly. And I'm going to follow up a little bit more on what Joe mentioned at the tail end of his remarks. Because one of the things that I think this fits a pattern that is enormously disturbing and is something that I've been raising on the campaign trail since the day I announced my candidacy, is this issue of the rule of law. We are a special nation in many ways, but one of the reasons is we have the rule of law. And one of the things that's very unique is that most countries don't. They truly do not. They do not understand the uniqueness of America. And one of the most dangerous things, and the IRS scandal is just part of it, that is happening in America is the shredding of the rule of law by this administration. And we see it everywhere. Obamacare, which I sued to stop, has been changed now by the Obama administration over 30 times. The President of the United States takes Obamacare, sees an issue, this group of people will be covered at this time, and says, forget it, we'll move it to here. You cannot do that. Under the Constitution, his job is to faithfully execute the laws, not rewrite them. And as your Attorney General, I took action. This EPA case that we had a good victory in just 3 days ago in the U.S. Supreme Court. But in some ways, that kind of action by the state, it takes too long. That took 4 years to make it up there. What we need is a senator who will bring in these different lawless agency heads and sit down with them first, if they're going to be confirmed, and say, you need to do certain things. And if they're not abiding by the law, to drag them in front of a Senate committee and pound them on this issue. And under Harry Reid and Mark Begich, that's not happening at all, which is why both of them need to go.
Mr. Treadwell, you have 2 minutes.
On the IRS, yes, we do need a special prosecutor. And when the questions that, it's not only the targeting, it's not only their own Rosemary Woods 18.5-minute gap or lost data, it's the fact that they have been aggressively targeting people who believe differently than they do, and then they've hidden it. And that's not what our government's all about. Our government is there to protect our rights, not to take them away. And we have to remind them of that every time, every day, and that's what your senator is supposed to do. I think we've also got some other problems. Homeland Security. I cannot believe with a straight face that our Department of Homeland Security in 2014, this year, suggested that we have a network of sensors to figure out what license plates are going where. But they did. I can't believe, and I've heard one of the other candidates at this table say, well, our spying has to go for the bad guys, but protect the good guys. I cannot believe that we justify for ourselves in any manner The government violating the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution and collecting oceans of data and then saying we're going to have a secret court tell us where we can open up what we want to open up. We should not be spying on Americans. The problem that we have here is not just the fact that the president won't follow the rule of law. The problem is that we have a divided House and Senate. And whatever the House does to bring this up, the Senate's not going to deal with it. Mark Begich has voted with Barack Obama 97% of the time. Harry Reid won't even let you have that hearing, Commissioner. And the fact is we as Republicans in a swing state that will swing control of the Senate are going to help solve this problem for all of the rest of Americans. We've got to put limits back in government. We've got to bring government back to protecting our liberty, and we have to enforce the Fourth Amendment.
Mr. Miller, you have 1 minute to ask a question of your opponents.
Well, I'm equal opportunity offender here, so this one's for you, Meade.
Thanks, Joe.
Let you off the hook this time, Dan.
I was feeling a lot of the love there.
So, Meade, the Juneau Empire reported on January 12, 2011, that both you and Dan Sullivan have both blocked pro-life initiatives from the ballot. You blocked one that would have protected, according to the initiative, quote, the natural right to life of all people from the beginning of biological development, end quote. The Empire reported, one, you believed it to be clearly unconstitutional, and two, that you believe both the state constitutional protections for a woman's right to choose or right to privacy and the U.S. Supreme Court case Roe v. Wade are clear. Now, I've heard you say that you're a constitutionalist. During the campaign, you've also said that you believe in the right to life from conception. But the Empire reported that you said the Constitution protects a woman's right to privacy. You can't have it both ways. So my question is this: are your pro-life views unconstitutional or just politically convenient? And why would you disenfranchise pro-life voters of this state, pro-life voters of conviction, by taking away their access to the democratic process?
Joe, thanks for that question. And I guess it's back to me for the question I asked you the other day, which is, where were you when we were fighting to get parental notification through the courts? Where were you when we've been fighting to get medical necessity to limit the amount of money the government is spending on abortion? Because it would really help to have conservative support on all this from the groups that you lead. But let me just say this. I agree that our Constitution, well, it says this, I'll just read it. This Constitution, Article 1, Section 1, this Constitution is dedicated to the principles that all persons have a natural right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I thought it was wonderful when an individual brought this case to us and he had written it wrong. He had written it wrong in a way that it directly confronted controlling law, a controlling law I don't necessarily agree with, but he had written it wrong. And we ruled that it was not admissible to go on the ballot in the way that it was. I kept the Attorney General's office open all night looking at this. There has actually never been a case where the natural right to life clause conflict and the privacy clause were ever pitted against each other. It hasn't shown up in any issue, in any other court decision. And then it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court backed me up. Had I ruled in Mr. Desjardins' favor, I'll just tell you the result would have been the same. And I spoke to the Attorney General's office, and I spoke to outside counsel on this, to a number of different people, all of whom said the problem was it was inartfully worded. And I would urge you to bring a petition before us that's better worded, and I will do my best to approve it. Because I believe that this part of the Constitution does need to be tested, and it certainly does have ample argument to be defined.
You're not required to, Mr. Miller, 2 minutes.
Well, it's not that it wasn't properly worded, Meade. The fact is you rejected it because you felt that it violated, or Roe v. Wade would have been violated if this were actually put before the voters, that it was unconstitutional. It didn't have anything to do with wording. It had to do with the content of it. And you know, there's a reason why I'm the only endorsed candidate of Alaska Right to Life, because I am unequivocally pro-life. And I got to tell you, the courts are wrong on this issue. They are. Roe v. Wade was one of the most poorly written decisions, one of the most poorly rationalized decisions in the history of the courts. Akhil Amar, my professor at Yale Law School, not exactly a bastion of conservative thought, acknowledged that decision as being one of the worst written. We take an oath of office to the Constitution, Mr. Treadwell. We don't take it to the Supreme Court. And frankly, the reason that we have problems like we have today, with people hiding behind the Alaska Supreme Court and saying, you know, I can't do this because the Alaska Supreme Court says I can't, or I can't do this because the U.S. Supreme Court says I can't. It really is abdicating your duty when you take that oath to the Constitution, if you really do believe that the Constitution protects life. Do we believe that? I certainly do. I think that's one of the foundations of Western values, and it certainly is reflected in our Constitution, both at the state and at the federal level. And just because we have activist judges that don't care much about their oath of office and haven't been impeached yet, and I think they ought to be impeached too. I do. I'm telling you. You know, it'd take 2 or 3 impeachments and the judiciary would start thinking straight, and they'd stop hiding behind the Supreme Court. You know, these are tough decisions, Meade, that have to be made. And this is the whole issue of compromise I've talked about before. We are in a cauldron of pressure. When you go to Washington, D.C., it is enormous. You cannot operate according to friendship. You can't operate according to hiding behind the Supreme Court. You have to operate according to law, the Constitution, and conviction, or else this nation's lost.
Our next audience question is, do you support federal term limits? If so, will you voluntarily term limit yourself? Mr. Sullivan, you may speak first.
Well, I'm trying to make sure that another U.S. Senator has term limits, and that's Mark Begich being a one-term U.S. Senator. And from my perspective, I would need to look at what the term limit time is. The only issue that I think you balance with regard to term limits are 2. You know, we have huge, huge problems in this country. $17 trillion of debt on our kids' backs, an economy that won't grow, a federal government that overregulates every element of our lives. And to me, the blame there is very bipartisan, very bipartisan. And one of the things that I think is to cause is career politicians. I'm not a career politician. As a matter of fact, I've never run for office before, unlike my other 2 candidate colleagues here. So from that perspective, I'm very interested in term limits. The problem, though, also arises that if you have term limits, you can also have a situation where you dramatically empower the bureaucracy, like it is in Japan, essentially running the country. And I think our worst nightmare in Alaska is a much more dramatically empowered EPA, Department of Interior, and other federal agencies that are undermining our future. So with regard to term limits, I would look at what the overall length of the term limits are, but I would be favorably disposed to term limits, but again, looking at the balance between career politicians and federal agencies that would be too empowered.
Mr. Treadwell, 2 minutes.
Very clear, I support term limits. I do not support unilateral term limits, but I do support term limits. And I believe that one reason why Congress is kind of lower than pond scum on the list of popularity by the American people is because Congress does so much to feed its own self. I have no interest in living under different laws than all of us have to live under as Americans. I have no interest in being in a different health care plan than all of us have the right to go under as Americans. I have no interest in being a member of Congress for personal aggrandizement. And I believe that term limits are necessary to help make sure that we really do have a citizens' Congress. We have over 500 federal agencies in this country. And many of them are artifacts of some unresolved crisis of the past. Government is incredibly vain. It has this idea that it can solve every problem, and it can't. And not only do I favor term limits, I favor the kind of limits that we have on the length of congressional sessions. They're not getting anything done anyway. They ought to be home with their constituents, understanding the constituents and the problems that they live under. And we need shorter sessions in Congress as well.
Mr. Miller.
I also support term limits, although I think we should be cautioned that that's not the cure-all to this problem. We mentioned the approximately 90 Tea Party members of the House, right, where you could only muster 23 to vote against the debt ceiling. Many of those were first-term, second-term representatives. You can't say, well, it's term limits. That's the reason they did that is because, you know, we didn't have term limits. That's not the case. The reason is because pressure comes in all sorts of forms. Sky's the limit. I can tell you leadership in the House is pretty brutal. I mean, we know not just leadership in the House, but even leadership in the Senate, both the minority and the majority in the Senate. And let's just talk about amnesty for a second. How many Republicans here support amnesty? I see one hand. Of course, I can't see very well, but it looks like one hand. That's not very many, but you know what? Your leadership supports it. We know that Mr. Treadwell supports at least a limited pathway for illegals to have citizenship. We haven't heard from Mr. Sullivan yet. I think he's kind of ambiguous, but the fact of it is he's backed by all sorts of powers out there that want amnesty. And those are the same sort of powers that buy their politicians. They do. You know, you don't have the type of support from Karl Rove and American Crossroads unless he's going to get the type of person he wants in office. You aren't going to have the people that are bought and paid for by other sources, by other powers in the political process, unless they're pretty certain that they're going to get the result they want. And that means basically that they get the response they've invested in. That's one of the reasons why I'm very excited about our grassroots momentum. You know, I really am not terribly concerned about geographic location on where money comes from, although we have a huge number of grassroots Alaskans that are invested in this process. What I am concerned about is the source and why they're investing. You know, we have, I think, $75 to $100 is our average contribution, and we've got lots of donors, over 1,000. Phenomenal people all across this state, all across the country that are investing in good government and know that I'll be held accountable to them and will work for them and not other interests. Thank you.
We move to our final candidate question. Mr. Sullivan, you have 1 minute.
So this one's for Joe. I'm an equal opportunity employer here. You know, Joe, I think all of us would agree that one of the biggest challenges facing Alaska right now is the continued decline in oil production from the North Slope. We have a good boom going on at Cook Inlet, but the North Slope has had 6% decline, despite the fact that the rest of the country is booming in terms of oil production. We took 3 years to try and get oil reform done. I was given the opportunity by the governor to lead the effort on SB 21 to design that bill and then get it through the legislature. Another example of action, not just talk. And I believe it's working. I'm seeing it all over the place in terms of the campaign. And a lot of Alaskans have been focused on this issue. It's one of the most critical issues in the primary. Vote no or vote yes on Prop 1. Since you've entered the race, Joe, I've been in a number of forums with you, and it's hard to tell exactly where you are. Mark Begich is on the fence. A real profile and courage there. He will not take a stand on one of the most important issues with regard to vote no or vote yes on Prop 1. So, Joe, I'm just wondering if you can give a straight answer on where you are on that very critical issue for the state of Alaska.
Mr. Miller.
Well, I don't think you were listening very closely, Dan, because at the forum that you and I were at, I did in fact tell you how I was voting on Prop 1. But let's just cover a little bit of the background on that. My time in Alaska, of course, I'm not going to talk about mayonnaise or anything like that in a refrigerator, but I've been here for 20 years, and one of the firms that I first started working with down in Anchorage handled the royalty litigation on behalf of the state of Alaska. A multi-billion-dollar settlement resulted from that. They were shutting down that litigation when I started work with them. I ended up, when I came up to Fairbanks after I was a state magistrate and acting district court judge and U.S. magistrate judge, working on the Trans-Alaskan Pipeline case for a number of years. In fact, 1 year I was the lead counsel on that case, where we litigated against the oil companies. And this is a matter of public record, but the oil companies were not always forthcoming with information. And that was kind of an understatement. The thing is, we have got to, as a people, evaluate things fairly and not just simply blindly go in a certain direction because we're told to do so. I think we have to operate with our intellect intact. Now, the legislature's made a decision. We presume that the legislature was well informed in its decision. I am a businessman. Contrary to what one of my opponents have said publicly before, I actually own 3 small businesses, and they're successful as well. Well, the bed and breakfast, maybe not so much, but certainly Restoring Liberty and my law firm has been successful that I've had as a small business for well over 10 years. And the fact is, we need predictability in what we do. And for us to go in by the initiative process and change a tax structure, just, basically a few months out from when the tax structure was changed by the state, I think is ill-advised and not wise. I've talked to the independents, which are very important to me and I think are very much the future of the state. Obviously, North Slope requires a lot of investment in capital. Independents obviously cannot be as effective there. So it has to be a hybrid approach, but the independents tell me that a no vote is appropriate as well. And so that's how I'm voting. But I don't think that we ought to just be blindly out there saying, hey, whatever you want. That's not the Alaskan way. It shouldn't be the Alaskan way. It's our resource. That's my answer. I hope it was straight enough for you.
That was straight. Thank you very much for that answer. I'm glad. I think that's all. Well, I'm not sure if Meade's allowed to talk about his position given where he is, but I think it's important.
I'd be happy to talk about my position.
If you would like to ask him the question, he's free to respond. It's up to you, Mr. Sullivan.
All right, now I'm really trying to debate this. Should I give him the mic or just cut him off? I think I like Joe Miller's answer, and I'm glad to hear it, and I think that's good for the state that all of us are similarly inclined, because it is a very important issue, and for those who are in the audience that may be on the fence, voting no on 1, I think, is critical to our future. And it's not about big oil. It's about the future of our kids. It's about creating an environment in terms of a competitive tax base that drives additional investment and jobs and production, just like we're seeing in Cook Inlet. And to me, as I mentioned, it's already beginning to work. And I agree with what Joe said. Also, the issue of predictability is very important. But this isn't something that was just willy-nilly passed. This was 3 years, thousands of pages of testimony, hundreds of witnesses. And we are the only basin in North America right now who has not done this with their production curve. Everybody else has turned production declines around. Everybody but Alaska. And we got to fix that, because we should be leading the American energy renaissance. And I think we're starting to turn the corner both in Cook Inlet and the North Slope, and that's why I think this Proposition 1 vote is so important to our future.
Thank you. Gentlemen, thank you for your responses tonight. I wonder if you could leave us with some final thoughts in your closing statements. We will begin with 2 minutes with Mr. Treadwell.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming out tonight for a conversation, because this has been a good conversation. And all 3 of us are running because we want to serve Alaska. I'm here to ask for your vote, but also I'm here to ask for your time, for your talent, for your treasure, and for your touch, because we all have reach to other voters. I also want to ask for your prayers for those of us up here and the others in this race, we all know that Mark Begich lost his dad in a plane crash, and we all lost Ted Stevens. So far, I've been very glad as I get around the state that we've had the same number of landings as takeoffs. I also pray and ask your prayers that we have a government that's moral, a government that respects life, a government that respects our liberty and our God-given rights. Now, tonight you've seen a contrast. And the argument I'm going to make very simply this, is to represent Alaska, it's important that you know Alaska. And if you're going to lead, you have to know how to listen. One candidate on stage said at one point, and we've kind of heard this before, that I might be too much of a thinker. Well, I'm just going to say this. With all the issues that we have before us in Washington, D.C., if you haven't heard Alaskans out, you don't know how to pull the groups together to actually win. If you haven't spent the time in this state, how do you know that people in the Arctic who want us to be productive also want to protect their food security? The people in Southwest who do so much to make us a leader in fisheries also want to know, why aren't we protecting against oil spills from itinerant vessels? People in the oil and gas industry wondering, why is it that we can't have a senator in Washington who understands and stands up to Obama to make our state competitive? Or people in Southeast who are asking, for gosh sakes, can't we get rid of this roadless rule that won't let us cut our timber, build our power plants, go for mining? I'm here because I don't want us to be clobbered in November. I want us to return decision-making home to Alaskans, and when we go out there into a general election, I will be the candidate who knows Alaska, whose experience, unlike Mark Begich, just made his first trip to Dutch Harbor, believe it or not, whose experience in Alaska is significant enough to lead Alaska and to lead in bringing decision-making home. I won't be tone deaf. We've got 57 days to go. We're surging. I'm very excited. Thank you, and God bless you.
Mr. Miller, you have 2 minutes.
People have asked me, why am I doing this again? It's a good question. I'll tell you why I'm doing it again. There's nowhere else to go. This nation is it. We're the only nation standing against internationalism. We heard about exceptionalism from a candidate backed from the very powers that are trying to drag us into an international system, from two candidates that have supported the law of the sea treaty, from two candidates that have compromised with respect to one of the most important elections in Alaskan history in 2010. The fact is this is all about compromise. It's all about who's going to go and do what they say they're going to do. I liked hearing what I heard today, most of it. I mean, probably most of you did too. 3 Republicans saying the right things, right? You know what? There have been races all across this country where that happens. Fortunately, the people of Virginia got it right. They understood that they were getting a bunch of rhetoric. All they had to do is go back and look at the record. That's all you need to do too. Look at where these folk have been, and that's going to be a guide as to where they're going. And we cannot suffer yet more compromisers. I'm doing this because of my family. I'm a grandparent as of December of this past year. Married to a beautiful wife who is just absolutely exceptional, and yet we're going through this again. I just got to diverge for a second and talk a little bit about Kathleen. And this woman sits on the Alaska Judicial Council. She's the mother of 8 children. She runs a law office. I mean, what do you not do? I mean, you run a campaign too. I mean, she is Wonder Woman. I mean, how could I not want to be with her every day, every week, every month of the year? But we're doing this because Kathleen and I know that our kids, our 8 kids and our grandkid, are not going to have a future unless we take a stand. And we're going to have to make those tough decisions. You know, we're going to maybe have to vote for somebody that's not as likable as somebody else. But the fact is, you can be rest assured, based upon my history of fighting the establishment, both the corrupt power within the Republican Party, as well as the incumbents that have drugged this state and this nation down, that you know what I'm going to do, and when I say it, I mean it. Thank you. May God bless you, and may God bless the great state of Alaska.
Mr. Sullivan, you have 2 minutes.
Well, thanks again, everybody. Great evening. Joe, you know, you mentioned your wife. I mentioned my wife, Julie. I think they're sitting right near each other. And I think we would definitely agree on one thing, that you and I both married up. So,
absolutely.
We can definitely agree on that. Well, I just want to say one of the things from my perspective, as a first-time candidate, I'm not like my fellow candidates here who've been running for office, it's a great privilege and honor to do this. Primarily because you get to do this. You get to share your views, listen to concerns, listen to hopes, and share and recognize that so many of us share the same dreams. And what is that dream? Joe mentioned it. We want to make sure our kids, my 3 teenage daughters, his kids, Meade's kids, have a future that's better than the one we've inherited. And it's not happening right now, and we all know it. And one of the most disturbing things I've seen on the campaign trail, I'm not seeing it a lot, but some people are losing hope. We did a meeting, we're doing a lot of home visits, people invite their neighbors in, and many of the people there were thinking that the country was going in such a bad direction that they were losing hope. We can't lose hope. We can't lose hope. We can turn the direction of this country around, but it's got to start by beating Mark Begich in November and taking this country back. And I believe I'm the candidate who can do that. And Mark Begich and Harry Reid, who have spent $2 million of attack ads against me. Perhaps you've seen a few. We are turning the TV off in the Sullivan household. They believe it too. They do not want to face me in the fall. Don't let Harry Reid and some of the most liberal Americans influence your vote. Take your vote. I would be honored by your vote in August. I would be honored by your vote in November when we take back our country. And I want to thank everybody here. God bless Alaska. God bless the great United States of America. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking all 3 of our candidates. And on behalf of the Alaska Republican Women's Club and the Alaska Integrated Media, thank you for coming tonight, and please, please, please vote.